In part 2 of our series on the biblical prophecy of the fourth trumpet, the dimming of the spiritual lights of this world, and how things like inspiration and curiosity seem to have dimmed right along with them, as if those two things were linked all along, we're going to see how transcendence looks when we try and represent it visually. What the problem is with relying on visual representations, and why it is that our culture seems to have lost its taste for history at the same time it lost its taste for the traditional role of the spiritual journey in the average person's life. From here on out, we're going to talk about concepts, and I'm going to keep coming back to a couple of metaphors to try and make these concepts more clear. The first of these is the image of the Stargate, just like from the movie. Ready? Alright, here we go. Imagine a world outside of our own, another dimension of sorts, but there's a kind of energy that slips out of this higher dimension down into our world. Now imagine that some people are better at accessing and utilizing that energy than others. Okay, what would that person look like? Well, if we stick to the Game of Thrones theme from the first video, for any fantasy lovers out there, you should all be familiar with what that looks like. A more spiritually attuned or empowered personage looks like an elf. The elf, or fairy, folklore, gives us centuries of attempts to visually display a higher being, higher up the spiritual ladder, and so more innately transcendent than the average person. So, what are we looking at? What distinguishes something as elf-like? Well, for starters, they're tall, thin, fair-complected. They use magic in a way that the average person can't, and they're deeply mysterious, living always just outside the cultivated lands of humankind. Okay. Now compare that to that other staple of fantasy humanoids, the dwarves. Short, bulky, earthy, not magical in the slightest. It may sound odd, but if we put this on a continuum, you start to see a pattern. We tend to think of transcendence as a move toward magic and mystery, and along the way we expect to see something less earthy, more ghost-like, not so base and low. Look at a couple examples. For the first, consider the pin-up girl. She's appealing to sexual desires, and to stay on topic, let's just call her full-figured. But what if we're not appealing to base, low, sexual desires? What if we're trying to represent a transcendent, artistic bit of fashion that someone might wear on their body? Well, then we get something that looks much more elf-like. I promise you, I can do this across all sorts of artistic mediums. But let's just take one more for now. Food. You see, I took the phrase magic and mystery from an episode of the Netflix show Chef's Table. More specifically, from the episode on Grant Achatz and his restaurant, Alinea. $1,000 a plate venue that we were told promises magic and mystery, if not so much a filling supper. Think about a meal meant solely to satisfy hunger and cravings. A plate of smothered nachos, steak and mashed potatoes, dwarf food.
There's malt beer, red meat off the bone.
Literally. Some smoky concoction made with liquid nitrogen. Elf food, if ever there was such a thing. And so we see an expectation of light and air as spiritual energy, or whatever you want to call it, flows into our world. There's just one little problem. What if we're wrong? What if it doesn't always look like that? Not to give too much away from the next video, but what if someone brimming with that higher dimensional spiritual gifting doesn't look elf-like at all? And you're just being fed a product and told that she writes her own music when the real creative spark is coming from someone who looks far more dwarf-like. You see, the eyes are very easily deceived. And not to give too much away from the upcoming series on the modern mental illness crisis, but I'm probably not surprising many of you if I tell you that narcissism has sharply risen in the West in the last 2 decades. You'd expect that since we spend so much more time now staring at pictures and video of ourselves all day long. But think about it in the context of our last video, and HBO's Game of Thrones writing team. The way they seemed uninterested in learning about the historical origins of the thing that they were supposed to be writing. And think about the current urge to erase our past. Why would they have such a distaste for history? And what does the image of the elf or fairy creature have to do with it? Well, history, in the words of James Robbins,
history and our understanding of it tells us who we are as a people in the same way your personal memories and experiences define and shape who you are.
The problem with that is, what if you don't like what it has to say? What if you're convinced that you're an elf? And then an elf is really the best thing to be. But history says not so fast. Take the current defund police movement, for example. Of course, it's based on a perceived grievance, but that grievance is based on a funny little assumption that has been creeping its way into our general worldview over the last couple of centuries. The notion of the inherent goodness of humanity. We're all basically decent, right? So why do we need to be policed by heavily armed agents of the government? Except that when we hold the mirror of history up to our faces, it has an answer to that. And it says we're not basically decent at all. We're basically civilized. We do what we do because of a risk-reward decision-making process that includes not just the carrot of comfort and advancement, but also the stick of punishment and prosecution. What happens when you remove the stick? When you remove all accountability from the population at large? History says it's not pretty. I mentioned this in the last video, that cultures that cared anything at all about history were not the default through the ages. They were the rare exception. And even the ones who did it only within certain tightly defined parameters. Compiling and understanding history is work. If you don't see the value in it, you're not going to put the effort into it. Most of the ancients didn't see the value because they had a pagan, so a utilitarian way of valuing the world. Things were important based on what they could do for you, and the extent you thought that through your own ability to manipulate and control your surroundings, or sometimes through magic, or through a magician, or divine being working on your behalf, you might be able to alter the reality of those surroundings. And in the modern age, we tend not to appreciate it because we tend to be so full of ourselves that we think reality is just one giant stage set up purely to display the glorious performance that is our lives. Just like D&D probably thought that they didn't need to immerse themselves in the late medieval history because they were just such amazing writers. I get it. We're all in our little echo chambers these days, and it's hard to see the bigger picture. But let me take the last part of this video to make the case for history, and so for reality, based solely on what it can do to open your spirit's stargate a little wider, and so reach your untapped potential. How much could you memorize if you really tried? In the late 1500s, the actors in the Lord Chamberlain's Men Company went around, sometimes performing more than a dozen different movie-plus length plays in any given touring season. They tended to play multiple roles, and so basically had to memorize every line in every play. Imagine picking up the complete works of Shakespeare, thumbing across a third of it, and knowing every word in that section by heart. And that's only impressive until you read the biographies of a Francis Bacon or a Leonardo da Vinci. Seriously, read the Wikipedia page on da Vinci. Sculpture, painting, architecture, the scientific advancements, the inventions, and on top of that, his contemporaries claim that he was so strong he could bend a horseshoe with his bare hands. The term Renaissance man comes from the fact that so many people during this period seemed to be able to do anything, and were dizzying combinations of soldiers, statesmen, philosophers, scientists, artists. How did they do it? In large part by rediscovering the learning of the High Greek period. Okay, so how did the Greeks do it? Lazy, overview type history will tell you that a Greek empire spanned the Mediterranean of the ancient world. Wildly misleading. There never was a Greek empire. What we call ancient Greece was nothing more than a bunch of city-states all around the Mediterranean that could never get together on anything, even when the Persians attacked. The reason we group them together is that they spoke the same language, the Greek language. And that language, and the stories that came with it, seemed to set them all on a path towards similar cultures. How does a language set you up for success? And now we reach the problem of only understanding something visually. You see, not long before the rise of the early Greeks, the only languages in the world had all been pictographic. Runes, or hieroglyphs, pictures. What's the problem with that? Don't they say that a picture tells 1,000 words? Sure. But those words are all jumbled up together, and it can be very hard to pull clear, precise meaning out of them. Here, look at these pictures. Imagine you had to read messages made only from strings of pictures. All right, what did I just say? Well, if you saw yourself in the first picture, you might translate that as, let's go to the beach. Not too hard. That was a simple action, not a complicated concept. Here, try one more. Okay. Am I sad? Am I disappointed? Am I resigned to some horrible fate? And what do those people have to do with it? Our eyes see light reflected off of the surfaces of things. That's it. They don't see concepts. And it's virtually impossible to convey concepts with pictures alone. So guess what? All those cultures based on pictographic writing, they weren't real big on concepts. In fact, when I studied them, they just seemed childish. That's what the Greeks thought too. They called them all barbarians, from ba, baby talk. I'd love to see a before and after picture of the early Greeks, to see how their alphabetic language changed them. But we don't know much of anything about them from before they acquired that alphabetic language. But we do have another picture of it. At the start of Israel's story, we're told that the Hebrews had just left 400 years of captivity in Egypt. They would have been thoroughly Egyptianized, and wouldn't have been any better at thinking conceptually than their Egyptian masters. What the scriptures say happened next is fascinating. In Leviticus 26, we're told specifically that the Hebrews were forbidden from making any graven images, as in hieroglyphs. Of course, no theologian thinks that Moses came down off of Mount Sinai carrying the 10 Commandments that were written in hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics were intimately connected to sorcery, a big monotheistic no-no. So what were they written in? They were written in the Hebrew alphabet, of course, which meant that someone had to invent the Hebrew alphabet on the fly.
Many petroglyphs of cows and people worshiping cows, as well as a structure that is slightly lifted that may be the altar in front of the golden calf stand. There's a sign in Arabic and English warning intruders against going into the area.
And there's a mountain in Saudi Arabia where you can see how the Hebrews invented it. It's called Jebel El Lawz, and it's hard to get to with the barbed wire and police patrols. This guy actually draws gunfire in the video. Apparently the Saudis don't want their mountain turning into a Jewish and Christian holy site. Go figure. Link below, I promise, it's interesting. And it's a pretty good synopsis of the archaeology, but it only goes into the writing found on site just a little. For a more in-depth discussion, Dr. Miles Jones hammers that out in his book, The Writing of God, examining the pictures taken of those writings. Just pictures, because, again, angry Saudis, the people that took those pictures actually got arrested. Dr. Jones explains how Moses, or, somebody, took the cursive form of hieroglyphics, along with a couple of other common pictorial languages from the ancient world like cuneiform, and turned them into Hebrew. One symbol, one sound, no magic. No pictures dependent on things you've seen with your eyes. Now the Hebrews could express deep, complex concepts by converting human speech directly into symbols that the reader would then sound out, directly back into words, just the way that I'm doing now with this script in front of me. This was an absolutely crucial step in the development of both monotheism and civilization. It would have been impossible to convey the concepts found in the Bible with pictures alone. Think about it. Imagine Paul's letter to the Romans in hieroglyphics. How could he have explained things like redemption through grace using nothing more than drawings of stick figures and palm trees? It would have been nonsensical if it was the pictures of God. It had to be the Word of God. Now, The Hebrews didn't totally invent the wheel here. There was one alphabet called Thamudic already out there. The Hebrews used that too. That one eventually evolved in Greek, with about 3 times the total vocabulary of Hebrew, a much more nuanced language that could express all sorts of things in minute detail. People took that and their creativity was unleashed. Suddenly, their inventive spirits exploded. New ideas poured out, like the world's first analog computer. My gosh, that is Professor from Gilligan's Island level stuff right there. The point of all this being, if you want to access and use that sort of transcendence in your life, you're going to have to, first, be willing to accept it, even if it doesn't show you what you wanted to see about you and your place in the world. And second, you're going to have a means of understanding it and then representing it to others. And no, I'm sorry, OMG and LOL and all the rest are not going to cut it. That's the language of the formulaic, not the language of the transcendent. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Hit like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and put out at least one video a week. Also, our pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine, is available September 14th. Link for pre-order down below.